Let's talk about a historic groundbreaking happening here in South Florida. It's an Everglades restoration project known as Blue Shanty Flowway.
In January of 2026, when 16,000 acres of South Florida wetland drained overnight and field biologist Dr. Jennifer Rehage stepped onto the exposed lakebed, the mud beneath her boots was moving, and what came up from inside it had been living, breeding, and tunneling directly beneath the feet of every tourist, every fisherman, and every airboat operator who had ever crossed that water. Nobody had known any of it was there. What her team documented over the next 72 hours is still being studied, but the ecosystem they uncovered was only the first layer. Beneath the mud, beneath the tunnels, beneath the creatures, lay something older, something that rewrote what scientists believed had been buried in Florida's wetlands for thousands of years. This video will take you through all of it. Dr. Jennifer Rehage is not a television scientist. She holds a doctorate in ecology from the University of Miami and has spent more than 20 years studying South Florida's freshwater fish communities, specifically focusing on how invasive species alter the architecture of the Everglades ecosystem. She has published peer-reviewed research in journals including Freshwater Biology and Biological Invasions, and she has worked directly with the South Florida Water Management District on restoration surveys going back to the early 2000s. She is, by any professional measure, one of the people most qualified on Earth to walk onto a drained Florida wetland and understand what she is looking at. So when Dr. Rehage told colleagues after the January survey that what she found was something she had not been trained to expect, researchers at the University of Florida and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission took that statement seriously. The South Florida Water Management District had been conducting what officials classified as a routine drawdown operation, a controlled drainage of a large wetland system west of Lake Okeechobee, part of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan that has been in progress in various forms since 2000. The goal was straightforward: lower the water, expose the sediment, allow maintenance crews to assess the structural integrity of levees and water control structures, then reflood. Drawdowns happen regularly across Florida's managed wetland systems. They are standard practice. On paper, this one was no different from dozens that had preceded it. The South Florida Water Management District issued a one-paragraph public notice in December 2025. No unusual conditions were flagged. Nobody expected anything other than mud, dying vegetation, and a few stranded fish. That is the official context. What the survey team found when they entered the basin on the morning of January 9, 2026, is what nobody had predicted. The mud was riddled with holes, not scattered, not occasional. Hundreds of them, in every direction, as far as the field team could see across the exposed basin. Each hole was roughly 4 to 6 inches in diameter, rimmed with freshly displaced sediment. And from inside each one came a sound that Dr. Rehage later described to colleagues as a wet, grinding scrape. The sound of armored bodies dragging through tunnels. The team had encountered invasive armored catfish before. The suckermouth armored catfish, known taxonomically as Turrigoplictus, has been established in Florida waterways since the late 1990s, introduced through the aquarium trade and now widely distributed across the state's river systems and canals. Field teams knew the species digs burrows. What nobody had anticipated was the scale. According to preliminary assessment data shared publicly by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission in February 2026, the density of active burrows in several survey zones exceeded 40 per square meter. The ground in places had been structurally compromised. You could push a boot through the surface in areas where the catfish tunnels had collapsed under the weight of the dried sediment above them. The burrows themselves told a more disturbing story than the fish inside them. Several of the deeper channels, running horizontally beneath the former waterline, were large enough for a person to fit a forearm inside. The catfish using them ranged in size, with some specimens removed by the field team measuring over 2 feet in length. Adults that had been feeding, breeding, and tunneling in total darkness under the water for years. They breathe through a modified digestive tract that allows them to take in atmospheric air, which is part of why they survive drawdowns while native fish cannot. When the water drops, the native species suffocate. The armored catfish simply retreat deeper into their burrows and wait. But that was not the detail that stopped the survey team. On the third day of the survey, when crews reached the deepest section of the drained basin, a zone of concentrated organic sediment that had apparently not been fully exposed in any previous drawdown, they found something else entirely. Bones, not fish bones, not alligator remains. Human remains, reportedly embedded in the peat layer at a depth of approximately 3 feet below the former waterline, in a section of the basin that had been continuously submerged for, according to initial estimates from geologists who were called in, at least several thousand years. The exact details of what was recovered remain partially under review, with the Florida Division of Historical Resources having been notified within 24 hours of the discovery. But the initial report filed by the survey team described multiple skeletal elements, reportedly including long bones and at least one cranial fragment wrapped in what appeared to be decomposed organic fiber. They were found in close proximity to one another, in a position that was not consistent with accidental drowning. Someone, at some point in the remote past, had placed these individuals in this water deliberately. If that sounds familiar, it should. In the winter of 1982, a backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjagt was clearing a pond near Titusville, Florida, in a development called Windover Farms, roughly 90 miles north of the January 2026 survey site. Vanderjagt picked up a round, brownish object from the muck. He turned it over. 2 empty eye sockets stared back at him. The object was a human skull, and it was extraordinarily old. The site that Vanderjagt had accidentally exposed became one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. What excavators from Florida State University unearthed at Windover Pond between 1984 and 1986 was a peat-bottomed pond cemetery containing the remains of 168 individuals. Radiocarbon dating established that the burials had taken place between approximately 6,990 and 5,120 years ago, making the Windover people roughly 3,000 years older than the reign of Tutankhamun and 2,000 years older than the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. The bodies had been placed in the water in a fetal position, lying on their left sides, heads pointed west, faces turned north. They were wrapped in woven fabric, the oldest known woven textile in the world. Sharpened wooden stakes had been driven through the burial bundles to hold them submerged beneath the surface of the pond, while decomposition proceeded in the anaerobic peat below. The peat's chemistry, non-acidic, oxygen-depleted, had preserved what ordinarily would have vanished within a generation. When archaeologists opened the skulls, 91% of them contained intact brain tissue, not mineralized, not fossilized, soft, preserved neural tissue, from which researchers were able to extract and successfully sequence ancient DNA, a scientific first at the time of the excavation. The stomach contents of one woman indicated her last meal had been fish and berries. DNA analysis revealed that the same extended family had returned to this specific pond to bury their dead for more than a century, and the condition of the bones told a final, quiet story that researchers did not fully expect. Multiple individuals showed evidence of long-term physical disabilities, healed fractures, degenerative joint disease, conditions that would have made hunting and foraging impossible. Those individuals had been kept alive, fed, and cared for by the people around them for years before they were carried to this water and placed into the ground. This was not a primitive survival group. This was a community with memory, with ritual, with compassion. The question that followed the Windover discovery, a question that archaeologists have spent 4 decades trying to answer, is how widespread the practice was. Florida's geology makes it uniquely hospitable to this kind of preservation. The state sits atop a vast carbonate platform, riddled with sinkholes, springs, and ancient freshwater systems. During the last ice age, sea levels were roughly 300 feet lower than they are today, and what is now the Gulf of Mexico coastline was, for thousands of years, dry land. Ancient peoples lived, hunted, and built communities on terrain that the rising ocean swallowed roughly 8,000 years ago. The Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research has documented multiple submerged prehistoric sites along both the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Sites now sitting in 10, 20, and 30 feet of water that were once open ground. Warm mineral springs, a natural limestone sinkhole in Sarasota County, yielded human skeletal remains and artifacts dating back 12,000 years, predating the Windover burials by several millennia. Little Salt Spring, also in Sarasota County, produced evidence of a Paleo-Indian occupation from 12,000 years before present and an archaic burial ground approximately 8,000 years old. And in Vero Beach, when workers dug a large drainage ditch in 1913, they pulled up the bones of prehistoric animals, mammoth, mastodon, extinct horses, giant armadillo, alongside what appeared to be human remains. In 1915, naturalist Frank Ayers walked the banks of that canal and noticed a human skull protruding from the exposed soil. 26 fossilized human bones and fragments were eventually recovered at that site, now known as the Burrow location. Florida's wetlands are not just ecological systems, they are archives. Imperfect, difficult to access, and perpetually threatened, but archives nonetheless. Every acre of peat that dries out and oxidizes away is a chapter of human history that vanishes permanently if you have never encountered any of this before. The bog burials, the drowned prehistory, the hidden worlds beneath these waters. Hit subscribe right now, because this is precisely the kind of buried history and concealed natural science we go deep on every week. The stories that do not fit neatly into a textbook, the discoveries that researchers spend careers trying to fully understand. New videos drop regularly, and none of them are straightforward. Back to January 2026, and the question that the survey team and subsequently contacted archaeologists have been working through is the skeletal material found in the drained basin connected to the broader pattern of wetland burials already documented across South Florida, or does it represent something distinct? The answer, according to preliminary statements from the Florida Division of Historical Resources, is that the material is still being assessed. Radiocarbon dating results had not been publicly released as of early May 2026. The exact number of individuals represented by the recovered remains has not been officially confirmed. What the division has confirmed is that the site has been marked, the area restricted from further survey activity pending full archaeological evaluation, and that the discovery was significant enough to warrant immediate notification of the State Historic Preservation Officer under Florida Statute 872.5, the law governing the treatment of human remains found outside of designated cemeteries. What that means in practical terms is that there is something down there worth protecting, and protecting it, in the context of an active restoration drawdown, is not a straightforward task. The sediment is drying. Every day that passes without controlled rehydration of the recovered material risks further degradation of organic components that, under the right conditions, might otherwise be preserved for future study. The Windover excavation team faced exactly this problem in 1984 and solved it by working quickly, keeping recovered material wet, and transferring specimens to the University of Florida's laboratory facilities within hours of excavation. Whether the January 2026 team will have the resources and logistical support to do the same remains, as of this recording, unclear. There is a broader scientific dimension to this story that gets less attention than it deserves. The armored catfish burrow network documented during the January 2026 drawdown is not simply an ecological problem, although it is certainly that. The physical disruption caused by Pterygoplictes burrows has been documented in peer-reviewed literature as a direct threat to riverbank stability in Florida waterways, with studies showing accelerated bank erosion in canals where the species is established. But in a wetland basin with documented subsurface archaeological significance, the burrow network poses a specific, irreversible threat. Armored catfish tunneling through sediment at depth does not distinguish between inert mud and 3,000-year-old peat containing preserved organic remains. There is no evidence, as of current reporting, that burrow activity had reached the sediment layer where the human remains were found. But the question of whether previous drawdowns, there have been several in this general region over the past 20 years, had already disturbed material at shallower depths is one that may never be fully answered. The Burmese python, the other dominant invasive presence in the Everglades ecosystem, adds a different dimension. Studies from Everglades National Park, published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, documented population declines of up to 90% for raccoons, opossums, and bobcats in areas with established python populations. The pythons are apex predators in a system that never evolved in their presence. They are 20 feet long, nocturnal, extraordinarily difficult to detect, and they have been breeding in South Florida since at least the 1980s. What the January 2026 drawdown exposed, in terms of python presence, was consistent with the broader picture researchers have been tracking for years. Large adult specimens in the deeper channels, evidence of burrow use for thermoregulation during colder months, and concentrations of prey species in the same areas where the exposed ground showed the most intense catfish burrowing activity. The swamp, drained to its substrate, looked less like an ecosystem and more like the aftermath of a long, slow conflict fought entirely underground. What the January 2026 drainage event ultimately revealed in a single basin over a single 72-hour window, was 3 simultaneous stories unfolding on top of one another, each one invisible to the layer above it. At the surface, a routine water management operation, proceeding normally. Beneath that, a fully established invasive ecosystem of extraordinary scale, tunneling through the foundation of one of the most legally protected natural areas in the United States. And beneath that, the carefully arranged remains of people who had lived in this place before recorded history began, people who had developed sophisticated burial practices, who had cared for their sick and their elderly, who had wrapped their dead in fabric and placed them in the water with deliberate ritual intention, and who had remained exactly where they were placed, thousands of years ago, until a maintenance drawdown in 2026 broke the surface above them. None of those 3 stories were in the public notice the South Florida Water Management District filed in December 2025. The Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research estimates that there are hundreds of submerged and semi-submerged prehistoric sites across the state that have not yet been formally documented. The combination of sea level rise, wetland drainage, invasive species activity, and ongoing development creates a set of conditions that is, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, degrading the archaeological record faster than researchers can assess it. The Windover site was saved, in part, because a private developer named Glenn Mack purchased the land and donated excavation rights to Florida State University, rather than proceeding with construction. The January 2026 discovery sits within a managed government water system. The institutional incentives are different, the timelines are compressed, and the resources available for archaeological evaluation within an active restoration project are, to put it carefully, not guaranteed. Dr. Glenn Doran, the Florida State University archaeologist who led the Windover excavation from 1984 to 1986, stated in a 2019 interview that the Windover site was a 1-in-a-million find, not because pond burials were uniquely rare in prehistoric Florida, but because the conditions required to preserve organic material for 8,000 years are extraordinarily fragile and will not survive any significant disruption. What that means for the January 2026 site is a question that depends entirely on decisions being made right now by bureaucratic processes that most people will never hear about, in a building in Tallahassee that most people will never enter. The people buried in that water had no way of knowing how long they would stay there. They had no way of knowing that the land they lived on would eventually be managed by an agency with a maintenance schedule. They could not have imagined an armored fish from South America tunneling through the sediment above their graves. They could not have known that the ecosystem they hunted, fished, and built community within would one day be classified as an invasive species crisis zone and drained by hydraulic gates. They placed their dead in the water with care, wrapped them in the oldest known woven cloth in the Western Hemisphere, and trusted the earth to hold them. Whether the earth is still holding what remains is the question that nobody has fully answered yet. That is what I want to know from you. Do you think Florida's water management agencies should be required to conduct full archaeological survey of any wetland basin before a drawdown is authorized? Or is that an unrealistic standard for a state with thousands of managed water systems and a perpetual flooding problem? Leave your answer in the comments below. The people who engage with this question seriously tend to have genuinely different and thoughtful positions on it, and I read every comment. If this video gave you something you did not know before, a piece of history, a detail about the world under the water, subscribe. Every week we go deep on exactly this kind of story, the things buried under the surface of the world, literal and otherwise, that change how you understand the present. New videos every week. The next one is already in production, and it involves something discovered beneath a very different kind of ground entirely.